I'm Greg Johnson. Welcome to Countercurrents Radio. This is the Countercurrents Book Club. This is our second book club this month. And today's book is Against Liberalism by Alain de Benoist, the leading thinker of the French New Right. And joining me today is the translator of Against Liberalism, F. Roger Devlin. Roger, welcome back.
Hello, glad to be here.
Well, I'm going to very much enjoy digging into this book. But before we begin that, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping around here. We are doing our fundraiser, and it's coming to an end soon. So if you've been waiting, don't wait much longer. The link to donate through Entropy is on the screen. It's entropystream.live/countercurrents. Go there, hit the green button, take out your credit card, and you can leave a donation. You can also, of course, attach your question or comment. And please, let's focus on the book if you've actually had a chance to read it. Now, the other thing I'd like to do just briefly is run through a list of people who have sent in donations recently and just thank them for what they've done. So we have a $50 donation from Finnish Moron. Thank you very much. I hope you actually are Finnish. David has sent $10. Charles has sent $10. Michael, $200. Very nice. Thank you. Voland, $10. Steve, $3,000. Wow, that's great. Daniel has sent $150. Albert, $20. Colin, $20. Paul, $10. Ben, $300. Again, very generous. $200 from Lee. $100 from Mark. We've gotten a couple of anonymous Bitcoin donations, but the amounts fluctuate, so you might not recognize it anyway. Be anonymous as you can be, sent a little over $120 in Bitcoin. Christopher sent 10. Jim sent 120. Rhodesian Ridgeback, $3.33. Archie, $5. Yuri, $50. Dan, 10. Kevin, 10. Tracy, 10. And Scott, 10. All of this is very much appreciated. It's very generous, and it will definitely go towards our annual goal. So we very much appreciate that. So I would like to just dive into the Benoist book now. And I was just wondering if you would give us just a few initial opening thoughts, Roger. What's the significance of this book?
I guess the first thing we have to say, especially for American readers out there, is that liberalism is an equivocal term, and it's used in a somewhat idiosyncratic fashion in America to mean as an approximate synonym for progressivism. And that's really not what Benoist is interested in talking about. He's interested in talking about the philosophical tradition of liberalism that derives from John Locke. It's closer to the political position that would be called libertarianism in America today. And its fundamental elements are the view of society as a collection of individuals, an aggregate of individuals, and the economic market as a kind of model for social life in general. So it's a somewhat narrower subject than an American might be inclined to guess from the title.
But he does include what we would call the progressive left or the center left under the rubric of liberalism.
Yes, that's a variety of liberalism, like the views of somebody like the late John Rawls are certainly a type. They are in the heritage of liberalism. So much of the political debate in America, at least, concerns kinds of liberalism. There's like a left liberalism represented by, the thinking of somebody like Rawls, and the right liberalism that gets called libertarianism. That emphasizes the free market and private property rights.
It is interesting that in the past, 35 years or so, it's not a recent phenomenon now, the left, the progressive left, has basically conceded to the market model of society,
Yeah.
and this is what we call neoliberalism.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the old left that wanted to seize the, seize the means of production and develop the economy according to a centralized pattern, that really doesn't even exist anymore. Frankly, I think that you do occasionally hear people on the left in America talking about socialism, but they don't sort of. One wonders whether they even really have in mind an old-fashioned planning bureau of the Soviet type, and if they're not just thinking about taking Whitey's money or something like that. It's the ideal of the centrally planned economy is scarcely found anymore, and this was widely acknowledged by the left-wing parties following the collapse of communism, and in France even somewhat before. Of course, Benoist is writing from a French perspective. Now, the first Francois Mitterrand was the first socialist president of France in 1981, and he did all the things that traditional socialists do. He started nationalizing industry, and as happens, everywhere else it's been tried, it turned into an unholy disaster. And within 3 years, the French economy was, hurting really badly. And so at that time, 1984, he did this completely inconsistent about face and dropped the whole socialist economic program. And from that day to this, the French left has concentrated on cultural issues, on anti-racism and feminism and egalitarianism, and has completely thrown up the economic ideas of the old left. And that happened in France in about 84, and in other countries soon after about 1990 at the latest. So that was, yes, that's the beginning of our current age of neoliberal globalism, basically.
And he's very much thinks that this is liberal because one of the essential things in his discussion of liberalism is the idea of the market as a model of social interaction. I guess the big issue is, what does the market as the model of social interaction, and what does individualism as I guess, a moral and a metaphysical claim that we are individuals and that we ought to be individuals, and no one
Mm.
has the right to stand in the way of individuals. How
Mm.
what is being rejected
Yeah.
by that model? What's being
Well,
left out?
I would let me. That's a big question. Let's talk about the first part of the question about the economics as a model of human behavior. Uh, the buyer and seller, the person on the market is seeking his private interest. He's trying to maximize his private interest, and the way he does this is by having recourse to money, which is a kind of homogenous thing that allows preferences to be made arithmetic, translated into arithmetic language. They're reduced to, or how much are you willing to pay for this, or how low a price are you willing to sell this for? Uh, that's it's a kind of a calculating way of looking at human desire and human intentions. While it might provide a pretty good account of, like, the market for potatoes, there are some aspects of human life that it doesn't leave out. Like it would might be very difficult, for example, to account for somebody's erotic choices or somebody's religious commitments on such a basis. And indeed, a whole lot of life just seems kind of awkward, or in not susceptible to being reduced to that kind of model. I guess like utilitarianism is like a philosophical style of thinking that's based on the market. You imagine, like, somebody like Bentham imagines pleasures and pains as these homogeneous, quantifiable things that you can have more and less of, and tries to draw up a whole moral system based on that model, kind of in the way that an economist would draw up a model of the economic market.
Yeah, so the market model of society always talks about given preferences. You have certain preferences, and they're just there. And sometimes, if you inquire, they'll say, well, these are natural. Everybody wants these. This is just nature. But it doesn't really inquire into preference formation so much as it just says, look, if you have certain preferences, there are certain ways that rational self-interest, rational agents can satisfy their given preferences through interacting with others. That would be trading value for value. If you want to steal, that's one strategy, but it'll produce countermeasures that will make you think that that's not in your rational self-interest. And so they generate this idea of society as basically a peaceful marketplace where people are just being self-interested and persuading one another to trade with one another. And that's the model.
Let me stop you at the word peaceful there. I mentioned like religious commitments and erotic decisions as some of the things that are hard to account for in this way. Another thing that you can't really account for through economic style thinking is war. Liberalism has never been able to explain why men, rather commonly throughout history, have been willing to risk and even sacrifice their lives for their communities in war. It's the sacrifice of life itself is simply incommensurable with the price of any piece of merchandise. So that's a whole area that liberals are uncomfortable talking about. Like if you read Ludwig von Mises, all he really has to say about war is that it's bad and should be avoided. And of course, you don't really need a master economist to teach you that.
Right, exactly. The other dimension here is the individual. So you've got individuals that are given with their preferences that are given. And then they start.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you one more time? I wanted to come back to what you were saying about the preferences being treated as given. That is a very important point. If you, for example, if you read the classical thinkers like the Socratic dialogues, there's an awful lot of talk about what one ought to want in life, or what is choice worthy. And this is something that's kind of completely blinded out, completely abstracted from in liberal thinking. Your desires, all of them, your desires to everything from your desire to fornicate to your desire to live a life pleasing to the Almighty or something like that, are treated as commensurable and comparable. And so there's that, right, as you put it, your demands or desires are simply treated as given, and that's not true in the real world. That's not true in life. Young people often wonder, what should they want? Like, possibly women in particular wonder oftentimes what they should want. You there?
Yeah, the question is what ought we to want? But of course, liberalism just sort of treats that as given. And so there's a question of preference formation that's sort of outside the liberal model, the market model. And then there's the whole question of, more broadly, the formation of the individual.
Yes.
Can we treat individuals as the ultimate primary analytical things, the atoms, if you will, of social analysis? You can, I suppose, if you're doing economics. But
Marx pointed out that economists love Robinson Crusoe stories, but nobody grows up like Robinson Crusoe. Our preferences are formed partly in the course of interaction with other people. It's social interaction that to some mediates certain of our desires. It may not completely mediate, the need for food or clothing, but many of our higher order desires can't really be accounted from apart from our being members of a society that already existed when we were born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Robinson Crusoe shows up on the island as an
Yeah.
adult, and
Yes.
the question is, how do we produce Robinson Crusoes? Well, they were produced in a family and more broadly in a society. And so, yes, you can have a society without individuals, as a whole, but you can have a society without any particular individual. And every particular individual that exists comes out of a society in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, there's a priority of the family and the community over the individual, just in terms of what makes them possible. And then beyond that, yeah, go ahead.
Just as the society cannot exist without individuals, the individuals cannot exist in the form we observe them without society. And in fact, in the case of each particular individual, the society is already there once he's born.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of our preferences and a lot of our identity, more broadly, is formed through social interactions with other people. And it's perfectly legitimate, I suppose, in a social science to abstract away from all of that if you're just looking at economics, economic exchange, and so forth. But it seems illegitimate to take that abstract starting point and then make it normative, not just for understanding economics, but for understanding all of human life. And that seems to be the nerve of what he says is wrong with liberalism as an ideology, that it somehow blows up the methodological individualism of economic thinking and turns it into a model for society as a whole.
Yeah. An example of the mediation of individual desire by society would be the easily observable fact that some people desire things largely or exclusively because other people desire them. And in fact, you can see that particularly in the case of certain like economic goods that have conventional value. I guess like, the value attached to the metals, gold and silver and other precious metals. Their value consists in their being valued by others. And only a
Right.
few, that's even maybe like more common than things that are immediately and naturally desired, such as, bodily sustenance, food.
Right.
Yeah.
It is very funny that people say that gold is intrinsically valuable.
Yeah.
What does that really mean? Certainly, gold as a monetary thing, as a commodity, is really only valuable because you're assured that there will always be somebody else who wants it.
Who wants it? Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm tempted as an American. I'm a little bit reminded of the one. You remember the old television show Gilligan's Island? One of the running gags in the show is that one of the characters is supposed to be a millionaire, and he still thinks like a millionaire, and like he offers to spend money to solve problems on the island, but of course on this island where they're stranded, his money is of no value. He's the same as everybody else, But yeah, so right, yeah. In when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, I guess there may have been some gold scattered around, but it wasn't really worth anything until there were some more people and they started, making use of it. Probably originally for bodily decoration, and then eventually as a means of exchange. It is useful in that regard because it is homogeneous and almost infinitely divisible. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So, one of the things that I loved about this book was that it would have saved me a lot of time if I had read it 30 years ago. Because I look at this and I think, I was reading John Rawls and Michael Sandel and Friedrich Hayek 30 years ago. And I was struggling with all of these issues. And it would have been nice to have had this as a sort of guide. It would have saved me a lot of time.
Yes, I think so too. I agree. I also, we both have backgrounds in philosophy, and I remember plowing through Rawls and Hayek too. Not Sandel. I only discovered Sandel through Benoist, but he's a pretty good writer. That
he's very good. Yeah. And Alistair McIntyre, he was another one. Charles Taylor was another. I really found Taylor's books to be very insipid and hard to get anything out of. But there were a few essays that I encountered by him. And I realized that what he'd do is he'd take a 30-page essay and then bloat it up into a 600-book book.
Yeah.
And when he would just boil it all down, or when you read the seeds of some of these books, they were actually quite valuable. And so there was a very good debate going on really in the 1990s and a little before, back in the 80s, on liberalism versus communitarianism.
For the unfamiliar, we should say that Alastair McIntyre and Charles Taylor are, and Michael Sandel, I think to some degree, are representatives of the communitarian trend. There is an essay. One of Benoist's essays is, where is it? Communitarians versus liberals. And so, yes, he's opposing these communitarian writers to liberal writers such as Hayek or Mises or Rothbardians,
Rawls.
And Rawls as well. Yeah, the progressive liberals too.
Yeah, and that's really where you get a lot of these themes about criticizing what's been left out of the liberal model. Again, where do individuals come from and where do their preferences come from? That's left out. And you can't have a valid political philosophy without a valid anthropology that underlies it. And there's something that's been abstracted away. And a lot of these arguments that the communitarians use really, I think, are tried out with, I think the earliest source of these arguments that I know of is Hegel in his philosophy of right, where he criticizes basically what he calls civil society. But civil society for him is the realm of, basically, it would include the marketplace. And he tries to show that that's a legitimate part of society, but it can't be totalized. That you can't understand, say, family life on the model of the marketplace, and you can't understand the state or the nation on the model of the marketplace. There's something left out there. And so if you read the philosophy of right, where he sort of delineates the limits of these different realms, family, state, and civil society, and shows that they can't be reduced one to the other.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just as the state can't be reduced to an economy, for example, there have been other pre-modern writers that tried to model the state on the natural family, and that's there are analogies between family, market, and state, but they're not identical. They always break down at some point.
Who would an example of that be? Would that be, say, Filmer's Patriarchy?
Yes, exactly. Patriarcha. The monarch is like our father, right? And he, derives his title from Adam. Yeah. But the idea is even found back in Plato and Aristotle that a state is kind of like a family on a larger scale, but not altogether, right?
Right.
There's a specific civic relation that's not identical to biological brotherhood. And the same is true of the anyway. The same is true of the market. Is all that Benoist is saying.
Yeah. So, what is Benoist's alternative to liberalism? Sometimes he says that there's a difference between a society with a market, which is something that he accepts, and a quote-unquote market
And a
society.
market society.
Meaning that the market is the model of all of society.
Yes. I think that phrase may go back to the German economist Wilhelm Röpke. Said he was in favor of a society with a market, but not a market society. He was an unusually broad-minded economist who was not a reductionist, you know. So yeah, that's right. Economic life is a part of our social life, and the world, right? The worlds of religion, military, eroticism, all family life, all those are different realms, and it, you can make analogies between them. I guess you know about Gary Becker, this economist who tries to account for marriage and family life through on an economic model. You can sort of do it. You can like look at a man's dating choices as like an investment of time compared to a perceived possible reward, and you know, you can produce an analysis like that, but it's not going to be perfect. Again, it's just like there's a certain analogy that works to a degree but breaks down at a certain point. And basically what society is like a bunch of overlapping realms between which there are imperfect analogies, you could say.
Right.
Yeah.
And dialectic, the way that Hegel practices it, is basically an attempt to articulate a complex whole like society. And what you do is you say, well, society's like the family. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's like the family. But if you try and make it totally like the family, that doesn't work. And so you take a partial explanation and you totalize it, and then it breaks down. And so you discover, wait, there are other things that are not being taken account of here. And so we have to expand our vocabulary a bit. And so it's through a process of basically it's a kind of trial and error whereby you articulate more and more fully a very complex whole that you're trying to understand. And it's especially difficult when you're inside that whole and situated as part of it. But it is analogous to the way that, say, Socrates in the Platonic dialogues will go through a phenomenon like justice, and he'll say, well, what is justice? And somebody says, well, you know, an example of justice is paying back what you owe.
Right.
And Socrates can generate an example or a situation where that wouldn't be just.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. And so what that presupposes is that we know what's just, but we're not fully clear about it, and we haven't fully articulated it. And so we have to change our account a little bit to articulate it better and better. And so through trial and error, you get a more adequate articulation of some complex phenomenon.
Yeah. That's right.
So let me talk about back to Benoist's alternative. I mean, he thinks that a market is part of society, but you can't adequately model the whole of society on a market. So what do you think is his more adequate account of society?
The communitarian critics of liberalism that he mentions go in different directions. Some of them actually are Hegelians. I think Taylor doesn't he appeal to Hegel, and McIntyre to Aristotle. To my, maybe just because of my reading habits, I see a lot of analogies between classical thought, Plato and Aristotle, and what Benoist says. But the work is a polemic, not really a treatise on political philosophy. And so the emphasis is on the limitations of liberalism more than his positive vision. But his positive vision I would describe as being fairly classical, being, you know, compatible with what you find in Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, I would agree. He seems to be a believer in classical political philosophy. And the two things that strike me as the clearest indications of that are, first of all, that he is a believer in the idea of the common good. There's a common good over and above individual goods, and this, of course, is what's left out of economic individualism. And that's one of the things that liberalism definitely tries to get rid of or circumscribe or make basically something that can't be pursued by political means, the idea of a common good.
His way of putting it is, for the liberal, the common good is merely the aggregate of individual goods. It's
right.
Again, it's exactly the way, like it exactly mirrors Jeremy Bentham's way of thinking about morality. It's a sum of, where everybody is like one point. What every individual, every individual's desire is like one point, and you just add it all up.
Yeah. And another feature of his thinking about politics that seems to be inherently classical is how normative it is. He doesn't treat values or as simply given. He really has a sense that there's certain things that ought to be valued and certain things that ought not to be valued. When he talks about sovereignty, he's a strong believer in sovereignty. Sovereignty for him is a norm.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a description of actual power relationships. It's first and foremost a norm. And I think this is consistent with Aristotle, but others might disagree that Aristotle is a believer in the idea of popular sovereignty, the sovereignty of the whole society.
Let me
common
stop
good.
you there. Let me stop you there, Greg, and ask about this. Sovereignty is often treated as a mere political fact. I guess, like the Schmittian definition of the person who decides on the state of exception, for example, is I guess the implication is there's always such a person, and if you could just find who it is, then you know who the sovereign is. What does it mean for sovereignty to be an ideal? Is that like a critique of the idea of split sovereignty in the EU, where some of the decisions come from Brussels and others come at the national level, or what does that mean?
Well,
is that an embrace of the nation state, for example, or what?
Well, the idea of popular sovereignty, for instance, I think first and foremost means government for the people. It's a statement of who ought to be the beneficiary of collective state action.
Okay.
Right. As opposed to government for the elites or government for foreigners. Right. The normative sense of popular sovereignty is that the people as a whole should be the beneficiaries, the telos of state action.
Well, that's good, and that's not the same thing as saying that sovereignty is necessarily by the people.
Right.
Benoist does seem to have a certain sympathy for democracy, and talks about this is maybe more evident in his other book that I've been translating on populism that'll come out next year. But he seems to embrace democratic sovereignty, but you can still have an exercise of power, for example, by a king or by an elite. But even in that case, it ought to be directed toward the good of the whole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, normatively speaking, popular sovereignty is the idea that the common good of society is it's the norm that validates state action. It's what makes it legal or right. But there are different ways of bringing that about. And Aristotle, in his Politics, is wonderful at articulating this, because he says, when he talks about lawful government, by lawful government, he seems to mean serving the common good of society. Because when he talks about unlawful regimes, they always serve the personal, factional interests of one part of society at the expense of the others.
An
So yeah,
oligarchical elite or a tyrant, for example.
yeah. So he talks about 6 pure systems. One is government by one man that is either lawful or unlawful. If it's
Yes.
lawful, it serves the common good. If it's unlawful, it serves the private interests of the one man. If the same man can be a king, as he describes it, if he serves the common good, and a tyrant if he serves merely his own interests. You can have elite rule, meaning rule by a minority, and if it's for the good of the whole society, he calls that aristocracy. If it's for the private interests of the governing elite, it is oligarchy in his view. Yeah. And then when he talks about popular government by the many, and that's not by everybody, but it's government by one, the few, or the many. You can't have government by everybody, because there's some people who are too young, too old, crazy, whatever. But the many, if they govern for the good of all, he calls that polity. He has to coin a new term for it.
It's because the nomenclature is a little bit awkward in classical Greek.
Yeah.
And one of the things that makes these texts difficult for modern readers is that the popular government that rules only for the benefit of the many and like soaks the rich and is called democracy. So like democracy is supposed to be something bad. Basically, Aristotle and Plato thought democracy is what was responsible for putting Socrates to death. And making a lot of other real bad decisions during the Peloponnesian War. And so it was not an ideal for them, but they did acknowledge, or Aristotle certainly did, that there could be a more or less popular, broad-based government that was genuinely directed toward the common good.
Yeah,
and that's what we would call democracy, but he calls it polity, or a regime or something like that.
Yeah, so polity for Aristotle is one of the 6 possible regimes. And then what he does is he talks about mixed regimes, where you have elements of the monarchical, aristocratic, and popular regimes mixed together, and they check and balance each other, to use a modern term, because each group is zealous to protect its own interests. It will make sure that the other groups don't basically go beyond serving the common good and basically serving themselves at the expense of the other groups. By empowering, especially the many, you give them the ability to check the tyranny of the few. And he thought that that was a valuable thing for producing a just society. And Benoist seems to be very strongly populist in that sense. Populism is interesting because the people has 2 meanings. One, it means everybody, and then it also means a more conscribed group of people, namely the many, namely the non-elites.
Non-elite, yeah.
Yeah. And so morally speaking, populism is about treating the common good as the standard. But in political terms, what populism usually amounts to is figuring out ways of empowering the many to check the depredations of the elite few, because there's always people like that. And if they aren't circumscribed in some way by popular sovereignty, or put it this way, popular accountability, mechanisms by which the people hold them accountable, they become arrogant and intolerable.
This is getting maybe a little more into the subject of the next Benoist book on populism. There is, however, an essay in this liberalism book called Representative and Participative Democracy, which maybe we ought to talk about a little bit. The basic point is that what we call democracy almost always means representative democracy, which is a very specific form that arose in the early modern period. It did not really exist in the ancient world, I don't believe. And it was chosen, like, for example, it was chosen by people such as the founders of this republic, because they feared an uncontrolled democracy. In
Hmm.
fact, representatives acquire a kind of, a private interest distinct from that of the whole. And Benoist is a little suspicious of representative democracy. He notes that it has a tendency to degenerate into oligarchy. And
Hmm.
certainly you can see that with the political class in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of his more important topics. And he does return to this in the populism book as well. He cites Rousseau here favorably. Rousseau believed that representative democracy was a terrible thing. It basically was the end of democracy because it was popular sovereignty basically abrogating itself or abolishing
It
itself.
requires you to alienate your freedom, your power of decision to somebody else. And as
Hmm.
soon as you do that, as well, Rousseau, with a bit of exaggeration, says as soon as you do that, you're a slave.
Yeah.
But at any rate, it ceases to be democracy in the strict sense.
Yeah. And it is quite true that representative democracy, well, I mean, we have this problem all the time in the United States. Even if somebody fresh and new comes on the political scene, as soon as they get elected, they go off to Washington, and the next time you see them, it's like the invasion of the body snatchers has
Yeah,
happened. They seem to have joined some new club. Something's changed
yeah,
about them. They belong to a different group now, and they're not one of you anymore. And it's
right.
amazing how quickly that happens.
The wasn't Congress didn't Congress exempt itself from the vaccination?
Oh, that doesn't
You hear about
surprise
that?
me.
They do this now. I actually heard recently there's been a proposal put forth, possibly I think it was by DeSantis, for a constitutional amendment declaring that Congress shall pass no law that does not apply to its members. But that's a perfect example of the kind of corruption that can occur in a representative system.
Hmm. Yeah. So I'm trying to get a bead again. Again, you're right to say that this is a book that's more of a polemic. It's a critique against liberalism. He's not putting forward his own positive political philosophy. Yet at the same time, he's criticizing liberalism for leaving out important things that he presumably would include in a healthy society.
Yeah,
And so it's an interesting exercise to sort of piece together a picture of what Benoist would like, because of course I'm only doing this because I want to figure out a better way of running society
right.
than the one we've got.
Yes. Okay.
Uh,
Uh,
so he does seem to believe in greater participatory democracy. He writes favorably of the idea of subsidiarity, which is
oh
a
yeah.
Catholic medieval, as far as I know, it's a medieval Catholic political doctrine. I think it started out with the church itself, whereby basically every function is as devolved as possible, so that if there's a certain jurisdiction, whatever jurisdiction furthest from the center that can
Yes.
perform a function gets to perform that function.
The bishop should not do anything that the parish priest is perfectly capable of doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is, well, it's anti-oligarchical, it's anti-elitist, and it gives lots of opportunities for citizens to be directly involved with decision making, if that decision making can take place on the local level. So that's a very kind of New Englandy town
Yes.
hall vision of things, which is quite interesting from a French intellectual because they're supposed to not like that kind of stuff.
He says, yes, he says that the maximum of democracy is the maximum of participation. It's not a
Hmm.
question of like how many are voting or ruled by numbers. It's the essence of democracy is participation. People should be involved in making the decisions that affect their own lives,
Hmm.
which is a half truth, I guess. I mean, there in a modern complex society, there are admittedly certain areas where specialized expertise is required,
Hmm.
but that does not apply to everything, and there are still plenty of areas in which people can make real decisions between different between alternatives.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is very interesting is he talks about this idea, this French term, la pensée unique.
Oh yeah,
The one thought.
the
This
one
was
true way of thinking. I think I translated it political correctness because it is the closest equivalent in the French language. But yes, it
yeah.
literally means the one and only true way of thinking. That's what they call it in France. That's anti-racism, feminism, the whole spiel,
Hmm.
neoliberalism.
Right. And he relates it to the claim by Maggie Thatcher that there is no alternative, meaning no
Oh yeah.
alternative to the market, which of course is now the neoliberal consensus. And the point that he's trying to make is that politics is inherently about decisions between
Yes.
real options. And technocracy and political correctness work hand in glove because they are both about trying to say there are some things that should not be options and
Yes.
therefore should be outside the realm of politics. It's very interesting. Brexit. After Brexit,
Mhm.
there was a great deal of flapping and clucking in the hen houses of academia and
Mhm.
the palaces of state and things like that about what a terrible thing happened here, and basically these Eurocrat types and elitist types were saying, you know, there are some things, some questions that simply should not be put to the people.
Mhm.
There are some things that should be above and outside of politics. And of course, the whole tendency of technocracy is to make more and more decisions to be those kinds of decisions that are outside of politics, and therefore you don't have to consult the people on whatsoever.
One of the ways that Benoit expresses this is by pointing out the difference between go- the nuance between government and governance.
Right.
Governance is the management of things. A manager, or somebody who's in charge of keeping a machine running, let's say, is involved in governance. Whereas,
Or you can talk about corporate governance practices. It's like
yeah,
human relations and management language within a corporate entity rather
and
than a
that too though is
political
like
realm.
that too is like treating human beings as if they were a mechanical device, though. And there's a whole
Hmm.
kind of scientific kind of like psychology of management that applies to that. Is
Hmm.
essentially it's modeling human relations on relations between things,
Hmm.
whereas government is about choosing between
Yeah.
alternative courses of action, and that is something specifically human.
Yeah. And the tendency of liberalism, because it's so wrapped up in economism, is towards depoliticization. And this, of course, is why it's anti-democratic. Why, for instance, uh, modern liberalism was a bourgeois thing. And he talks about that too. The liberalism was an ideological creation of the rising middle classes in there's
There's a
battles
one
against monarchies.
there's a wonderful essay in the collection called "The Figure of the Bourgeois," which used to be it was something that right, the bourgeois was a figure of fun, sometimes a figure of quite violent polemics. I wonder whether young readers today even know what a bourgeois is, but he's the I guess he could be described as like the ideal type citizen of a liberal system. He
Hmm.
he he's a calculator. He's a man who pursues his own private interest in a rather dispassionate and calculating way, and who is very conventional. Values what other people value, and he values prosperity and comfort. He's
And
not a
peace.
fanatic, not the kind of person who would sacrifice his life for anything. And so traditionally, certain people have found this character rather contemptible. He does have his virtues, like not being a fanatic, and being regular in his habits, going to work every day. But he certainly lacks certain human virtues, the heroic virtues. He's certainly not a religious person. His ends are all prosperity in this world.
Hmm.
And this was a subject of general mockery by both right and left, as Benoist says, and it seems to have died down. The sort of the anti-bourgeois polemic or spirit seems to have died down, and Benoist suspects it is largely because in this era of neoliberalism, we're all more or less becoming bourgeois, rather than it's not because there are no bourgeois, but because there are no non-bourgeois now. So
Yeah, there's again, it's back to Maggie Thatcher. There is no alternative, and
yeah,
therefore there's nobody criticizing the bourgeois from an external point of view. That
right,
alternative seems to have just been lopped off or withered away, and so the middle classes, though, because they had more stuff, and they tended to be employers rather than employees, they constructed their governments and their ideologies in such a way as to protect what they had.
yeah, right. Protect their
And
things.
yeah, and one of the ways they protected their things is they were terrified of democracy, because of course they were looking at the classical texts, and they were thinking about democracy as allocracy, as mob rule.
Yes, yes.
And so therefore they create things like property requirements in order to vote, or representative democracy,
Yes.
so that they could make democracy as oligarchical as possible, especially if you have electoral representative democracy
Yeah.
and multiple parties. That is extremely good for oligarchy, because people with money are the ones who can run for office or basically support people who run for office. And therefore, the tendency of representative democracy is towards oligarchy.
Yes.
And it depoliticizes life as much as possible.
Yes.
But to depoliticize life changes the model on which we operate, so that we are not thinking about human beings as agents making decisions about matters of fundamental worth. No, we're only agents making decisions about goods in the marketplace. But most of what was called politics in the past is sort of subsumed into the management of things, governance, as you were talking about.
Yes. Right.
Hannah Arendt talks about this. She talks about the replacement of the public realm with what she calls the social. And I think this is the same basic distinction. It dehumanizes our interactions with one another by basically reconfiguring society as technocratic management of things rather than agents.
Greg, do we have any questions? Because we've been on about 53 or 4 minutes, I think.
Yeah, let me just see if anybody has actually posed a question about this book. Friedrich writes in with $70. Thank you very much. He says, hello, and thank you for the translation and all the good work you've both done and continue to do. Merry Christmas. Well, thank you very much. And that seems to be the only question. Let me just check and see if we have anything on Odyssey.
one constraint that we're working with is the book has only been out a short time, so I don't know how many people have actually been able to buy my translation. But
Well, it's been out
I
for,
a month.
I've been warning people about this, and we postponed it a couple of times to give people more of a chance. So,
Yeah,
but maybe people who have had a chance just haven't had a chance to ask us questions because this doesn't come at the right time or whatever. Let me just make
yeah.
sure we aren't missing anything on Odyssey. We have a couple of DLive tokens, which are greatly appreciated. Slog sends a diamond and wishes us Merry Christmas. Then he also donates 14 bells. I guess they have festive bells now at Christmas time
Okay.
over in DLive. Thank you. I also have another super chat here. It's not directly related to the book, but Finnish Moron did send $50 and he says Singapore is an example of a successful multiracial state. Counter arguments?
Oh,
Would you like to address that, Roger? Do you want to talk about that?
It may be significant that it's not a particularly democratic or liberal state. It is an authoritarian state. It's just a sort of it is said to be rather well governed, or at least was under what was his name?
Lee Kuan Yew. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Singapore is an interesting example of a state that is multiracial in its populace, but I would say that it is not multicultural in a normative sense. In fact, it is overwhelmingly normatively Chinese. First of all, it's got a Chinese majority, but even if you're not Chinese, you better damn well act that way.
Act like one, yes.
Yeah, the Chinese set all the standards there. And
it's a general observation of political science that democracy works best in a monocultural environment, an environment of ethnic and moral homogeneity where people think alike. And if you got a mix of people, it's generally best to have one of them hegemonic and to kind of go easy on the participative democracy, kind of turn over the government to those best qualified to rule.
Mm-hmm. And that really is an example of well, put it this way. Yes, you can make a multiracial society work, but it's very difficult to make it into a democratic, pluralistic society.
So the people who rule us, who claim that they're going to make us multicultural and protect our democracy, are essentially, what the Germans call a Verarschung. What do you say? It's a hoax. It's an impossibility. It's a contradiction in terms. It's not going to happen. We're not going to have a multicultural democracy. There can't be such a thing.
Yeah, I think the essential issue here is normative. It's possible to have a society with different groups of people in it, different races and cultures, that is still one in a normative sense. So the United States from the very beginning had outsiders in its society and around it, the blacks and the Native
Indians.
Americans. Yeah. But they were considered in it to some extent, but not of it. And normatively, America was a European society.
Yes, European settler society.
Yeah. And therefore, and even more strictly than that, it was very normatively Anglo and Protestant.
And Protestant, yes.
Yeah. And there's this concept called assimilation. And what assimilation is when people came into American society, they made themselves similar to it. Why? Because there were certain norms that were upheld, normative behavior standards, and they needed to conform to those. Now, the opposite of assimilation is multiculturalism. Right. Multiculturalism basically says that there is no one normative people and way of life in a society, that you can have many different cultures which are all somehow on equal footing and are all equally normative. and they've got to figure out some way of living together. And of course, now what we get is we get people saying, well, I'm sorry, but coming to work on time and math and
It's against
so
my culture. Yeah.
yeah, they'll say this is white supremacy.
Right. Yeah.
Mathematics is white supremacy.
Right.
And
Punctuality and
yeah,
uh,
well, they're right. The thing
yeah,
is, though,
yeah,
they're right about that. They're chafing against European derived norms of behavior
correct.
that are still normative, even though we're supposed to be multicultural,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We better wrap this up, Greg. I hope that if we didn't get questions because people haven't read the book, maybe they'll be tempted to buy the book because they're interested in our discussion.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe the causality will work in the other direction, and maybe we can do this again on the populism book when it comes out early next year. Is that fair to
Yeah,
hope?
that's the plan. Yeah,
And I should also say that I did a little talk, which you can find on Countercurrents, about the populism book at the last Countercurrents event.
yeah. So that is a good and
Post the link to that.
yeah, we'll do that. This is going to be well, it might not be our very next book club, but soon we will be doing in the new year a book club on the next Alain de Benoist book that is coming out, which is called The Populist Moment.
Populist Moment, yes.
Yeah. And this deals obviously with populism and basically the populist moment that began in 2015 with Brexit and Trump and is continuing on into the present. It was not the flash in the pan that people on the left or the right, the establishment, people on high were hoping it was going to be just a flash in the pan, but it has not proved to be so. And this book is a wonderful book with a lot of European perspectives and writers cited in it that I was just unfamiliar with. And so it's a hugely important addition to the contemporary literature on national populism.
Great.
Well, that does it. We decided we were going to just do this for 1 hour to make it more bite-sized. Short and sweet. Yeah. So, Roger, how do people follow your work? And can you tease us a little bit about things that you're working on now?
Oh, yes. Well, I write for, besides Countercurrents, I often write for American Renaissance, sometimes for the Occidental Observer and Occidental Quarterly. And I guess I'm most notorious for writing about sex, and I've actually gone back to that recently a little bit. So I hope there'll be some more essays in the vein of sexual utopia and power in the coming year.
Wonderful. Folks, thank you very much. Roger, thank you for joining us. I want to thank our listeners and our moderators and our donors. And we will be back in 1 week with another episode of Countercurrents Radio, and it's going to be our final episode of the year. We'll be looking back at this year and looking forward to the next year. And we're also going to try and wrap up our fundraiser at that time. So we very much would like you to join us then. And in the meantime, keep reading Countercurrents.
Goodbye, everyone.